Disuguaglianza.
Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando è una parte.
Come si fa a
La
costruire
scienza
una
ha
dinamica?
senso.
Difficoltà a fare riforme.
Il contratto in sé non sono le bolle.
Pronto? Si sente? Sì. Buonasera a tutti, io sono...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rossella Bocciarelli from Sole 24 Ore. I'm here tonight to give the floor to Steven FAZZARI from the US, from Wisconsin, with Italian ancestors. He is the head of the Department of Sociology at the Washington University in St. Louis. He is a professor of economics and also an associate of public policy and so on. Tonight we'll talk about inequality in wages as an obstacle to recovery. I would like to also talk about his experience as a scholar. He has many interests. He's carried out studies in many fields, even if his main interest is macroeconomics. He contributed remarkably to empirically define the influence of financial restrictions, which are the difficulties found by those who ask for loans. He examined the impact of such restrictions on the behavior of companies and the decision to invest to accumulate new assets. We know that important scholars such as Stiglitz or Minsky have their theories on the subject. He, on the contrary, provided statistical evidence collected on the field, which is extremely convincing. Those who followed the activities of the European Central Bank knows that limit to loans is much more than high interest rates. Companies, as a matter of fact, obtain the funds based on their ability to deserve credit. This depends in turn on their balance sheets and their the fact that they are known by banks, usually banks in Italy. And banks, if are not very familiar with the customer, they'll have lots of difficulty in giving credit. So there is an issue of information asymmetry which has to be considered. So guaranteeing the good functioning of financial channels is very difficult. Stimulating the economy demands more than low interest rates, because those who ask for a loan should have strong balance sheets and a good relationship with the bank. FAZZARI demonstrated with practical data of those phenomena starting from 1988. The speaker is considered one of the first members of the post-Keynesian school of thought. That school of thought, that of Keynes, indeed considered the issue of uncertainty in the financial world. So what's that? I'd like to summarize that based on Professor Sirinko. We speak of fundamental uncertainty to mean that the economy is not only risky as a rolling stone or a rolling dice. In our position, we do not know even the number of faces that the dice has. Post-Keynesians are reflecting on fundamental uncertainty and on the importance of aggregate demand. Tonight, we'll speak of a number of issues: the difficulty of having access to credit and the inequalities in wages. A recent work by FAZZARI, together with Barry Cinnamon, studies the extent to which increasing wage inequality is an obstacle to the economy of the US. Economists studied the causes of Great Recession of 2008 and the collapse of consumptions, low growth rate and stagnation can be linked to increasing wage inequality. In the study, the two economists explained that starting from 1980, the first 95% of wages is losing ground towards the 5% which are at the top of the scale. In order not to lag behind in the lifestyle, 95% started borrowing money till 2008, when the financial crisis was exploding, so they could no longer borrow money. 5% of the wealthiest could increase the wage or the revenues and improve their quality of life. The loss of purchasing power of the many is, according to the scholars, a job killer. And that is a depressing effect which will last for a number of years. So I'd like to give the floor to Professor FAZZARI, whom the interpreter invite not to speak too fast. So what are the factors which generated social inequality and why that is so dangerous for the future of American economy? You have the floor.
Thank you, Rosella, for that very generous and extensive, interesting introduction, talking about lots of the work that I have done over the years and moving towards the things I'll be speaking about tonight. You see on the screen here the English title of the talk tonight, Income Inequality, the Great Recession, and Slow Recovery. And underneath, at least the first part of the Italian translation I found in the official program, La luce in fondo al tunnel, I didn't quite understand why we had the light at the end of the tunnel as part of this title, but after a little bit of thought, I used my limited Italian skills, going back to my grandparents, to make a modification. So the official Italian title I would like to make is this, La luce in fondo al tunnel, speriamo che non è un treno. And for you English speakers, that means if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, we hope it's not a train. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm not quite sure what the answer is here with respect to our discussion today. Okay, so first let me acknowledge the co-authorship that Rosella mentioned from Barry Cinnamon. The work that I'll be talking about tonight is very much a joint product, and a lot of the creative ideas I'll be discussing come from Barry. And also acknowledge the generous support of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is the co-sponsor of this lecture tonight. So let me begin by talking about the message that I want to share with you. It's linking two major features or aspects of the U.S. economy. One is the macroeconomic experience of the last several decades. This is a period of reasonably good economic performance, at least up until 2007, starting in the mid-1980s, that in the U.S. has been called the Great Moderation, a period of relatively calm economic growth, two recessions, but fairly mild recessions, and reasonably strong growth, low inflation, relatively low unemployment for much of that period, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s. What followed that calm period of the Great Moderation was a historic recession in 2008, 2009, known in the U.S. as the Great Recession, sometimes called the global financial crisis, and then a surprisingly slow recovery. 6 years of what I think could be accurately called secular stagnation. That's the first set and the macroeconomic set of facts that I want to start with tonight. The second major piece that I want to tie together is rising inequality of income. And for those of you that saw the very interesting presentation of Thomas Piketty just a couple of nights ago, you saw a lot about the statistics of inequality across the world, but in particular in the United States. And I'll have more to say about that as we go forward. Let me foreshadow where I'm headed with several conclusions. I think we can make a strong case that rising inequality played a central role in the increase in U.S. household debt that ultimately triggered the financial crisis in the U.S. and throughout the world. Also, rising income inequality helps explain the persistently stagnant recovery in the aftermath of the crisis. And I'll have more to say to justify that claim. For those of you that know a little bit about the macroeconomic data, you might be thinking, well, the U.S. is doing relatively well. And that's true. The U.S. is doing relatively well. But I want to argue here that in an absolute sense, we could be doing better. And we'll talk a bit at the end about how the lessons from these experiences extend beyond the U.S. I apologize for coming to Europe and talking almost exclusively about the United States, but it is what I know, so it's probably what I should talk about. Okay, let me begin on the substance here to talk about what I'm calling a nasty recession and a slow recovery, give you an overview of my take on the data of the U.S. economy in the recent years. So we'll begin here, and let's see if this works. I believe, well, it's probably going to be hard to see if you're looking there, so I'll try not to use this extensively. But if you look at the chart, it's kind of rather a complicated looking chart, but let me explain what it is. I have taken employment for every U.S. recession beginning in 1974, 1975, and indexed it to 100 at the beginning of the recession. So they all start at 100. During the beginning of the recession, employment falls and then employment recovers. And I've tracked each recession until the employment level gets back to the level it was at the beginning of the recession. So, for example, if you can see my little cursor there, this is 1974-75. There's a sharp drop in employment, and then it comes back very quickly. The early 1980s does this. This is early 90s. This is the early 2000s, a somewhat more extended recovery. But the basic story here, and I could talk a lot about the nuanced differences between these different business cycles, but the basic story is they all largely lie on top of each other. The drop in employment is about, probably averages a little less than 2% across these recessions. 74, 75 was a little deeper. Some of the others were a little more shallow. The recoveries were more extended in the last two, but at the end they all seem to come back in about 3 to 4 years back to the level that we were before the recession began. So this was a sense of the kind of standard-looking recession in the U.S. up until this point. Now, what happens in 2008 and 2009? A big difference. So you can see a completely different kind of experience. In the Great Recession, instead of employment falling 1.5% to 2%, it fell about 6%. In the beginning, in the very first few months of the recession, it looked pretty much like what had happened in the previous business cycles in the second half of the last quarter of the 20th century. But then it really crashed starting in the fall of 2008 with the failure of Lehman Brothers and the emergence of the global financial crisis. Moreover, there is this extended slow recovery. It's taken now, finally I can finish my chart. The U.S. has gotten back to the number of jobs it had at the beginning of the recession in December of 2007, but it took about 76 months to get there. In May of 2014, we finally hit that point. Also, I should point out that this is not adjusted for the growth in the labor force. So if the recession's relatively short, you can pretty much ignore the fact the labor force is expanding. But for such a long period of time, the fact the labor force is growing makes a difference. And if you adjusted this for growth in the labor force, you'd find that the recovery is hardly even noticeable. Maybe in the last year a little bit, but relative to the size of the labor force, there's been hardly any recovery in the number of jobs in the U.S. So this starts to support my claim that the U.S. is still underperforming, even if it's doing better than other countries in the world. Let me look at actual output in this context, and the chart you're seeing right now is based on some official statistics that come from the U.S. government. The solid blue line, I hope it looks blue to you, is is actual GDP. The dotted line is something that the government calls potential output. It's an estimate of where the economy would be producing if it were fully utilizing its resources. And you can see that through most of this time, the actual gets pretty close to potential. There is this period in the late 1990s, which according to the U.S. government, the U.S. was producing above its potential. I actually would somewhat disagree with that view, but that's not so important for our discussion right now. Here's the recession of the early 2000s. Here's the recession of the early 1990s. You can see that the gap in the Great Recession is much larger. According to this measure, it's starting to close, but still remains quite significant. As of late 2014, the gap was still estimated at 3.2%. But I think even this underestimates the extent to which the U.S. has fallen behind where it could be. So let me show another slide, which is a bit technical, but bear with me. This is something I don't think you would have seen before, most of you. This is let me explain where this comes from. By law, the Congressional Budget Office in the United States is required to forecast potential output of the economy 10 years forward. And the government uses these numbers for budgeting purposes and for evaluating the effects of different kinds of policy changes. So we can actually go back and look to see what the government forecast was for the economy, more or less as we are right now. Actually, this is the third quarter of 2014. And what I have done here on the heavy downward sloping line is traced those forecasts for the same point, to trace the forecast for the third quarter of 2014 as they evolved over time. So the first one was done in 2004, and then every year after that. And this is the actual estimate, or at least the estimate a few months ago, of the GDP in that quarter. And so at the very end, you see the 3.2% gap, which looks quite small on this chart. So what is this telling you? That in a sense, looking back in the, say, 2004, 5, 6, and 7, before the Great Recession, the U.S. government was projecting the potential output would be dramatically higher than it actually is at this point in time. In fact, if you take the gap, as I've shown on the chart, and as estimated at the eve of the Great Recession in 2007, you have just under a 25% difference between what actually happened and what the government thought would be the long-term trend. So this is a really dramatic statement for how the economy has, in a sense, underperformed. Now, what explains this change? Let me share a few thoughts with you. I sit in front of you as a representative of what in the United States we call the baby boom. I was born in December of 1955 in the 2 decades following World War II, more or less at the peak of a large time of very high birth rates in the United States. Now, of course, the baby boom is getting older. I'll be 60 years old this December, and the leading edge of the baby boom, especially people born in the mid to late 1940s, are clearly of retirement age and are beginning to retire. So one of the thoughts here is that the retirement of the baby boom will slow the growth of the economy. It will reduce the size of the labor force. Well, there's a lot of things one could say about that. But let me tell you this. This is not a surprise. The fact that I am getting older is no surprise to anybody. And the same thing for everybody else in my cohort. The Congressional Budget Office, who makes these projections, knew in 2007 that the baby boom would get older. That's not a surprise. That can't really explain why why the forecast was so far off. What about some other economic factors? Well, slower capital accumulation. So one of the important factors that goes into the estimate of potential output is the business investment, the addition of factories and machines and computers and office buildings and all these kinds of things that we call the capital stock. And indeed, when the recession hit, there was a big drop in business investment. Let me show you a chart, and I'll come back here. There's actually 2 big drops in capital accumulation on this chart. The first one occurs after the bursting of the technology bubble in the early 2000s. The bigger one occurs right as, and actually if you look at it, it hardly drops in the first few quarters of the Great Recession, but once the recession hits, it drops dramatically, and it's actually come back quite significantly. But there's a massive drop, and if you think of this as somewhat normal experience, this gap here, this big dip, represents a loss in capital. So over time, this has been accumulating, but you see, it's the result of the recession. It's not the cause of the recession. The investment was actually quite strong up until the recession, even in the first few quarters of the recession. So that in a sense, you could say, this is a reason the potential output's lower, but it's because we've had weak economic performance. In fact, I've got a statistic here on the slide that says a recent report from the International Monetary Fund, which is quite interesting. It talks about the shortfall in U.S. investment as being 20% in this period, 2008 to 2014, relative to where they expected it to be pre-crisis. So again, an example of how the economy has underperformed. What about labor? Declining labor force participation. So indeed, there has been this effect. Let me show you another chart. This one is the ratio of people working in the U.S. to two different measures of population. The lower blue line, the kind of wavy blue line, is, I believe, number of people who are working divided by population over the age of 16. And you can see here that there was this period where the baby boom was entering the labor force, and also there was a big increase in female labor force participation when there was this upswing in the number of people working. It dropped off. It always drops in recessions. It dropped in the 2001 recession, but interestingly was beginning to recover. There's a bit of an upward slope here as the economy came out of the rather long stagnant period in the early 2000s. But when we hit the Great Recession, it drops quite dramatically and hardly changes at all. This is roughly what I had in mind when I said if you adjust the jobs for labor force and labor force growth, there's really hardly any recovery. Just to make the point a little more clearly about demography, I've also shown on this chart the upper line, which is what in the jargon of the statisticians we call the employment participation rate of prime age employees. So this is people between the ages of 25 and 54, so I'm well beyond the limit here. And here you see even bigger upward trend, but again the same kind of dynamics. A drop off in 2001, some recovery, we were moving back in the right direction, but then a massive drop. So the point here, let me just go back to the previous slide that said that both these factors, slower capital accumulation and declining labor force participation, are the result of the crisis. They're not the cause. They did not have to happen. And that leads to my conclusion of this first part. The U.S. could be doing better. Like I said, there was fairly positive economic news in the United States in 2014. Finally, the monthly job creation numbers were enough to do a little more than absorb the growth in the labor force. But this notion that the U.S. economy was doing well in 2014 was more about changes than levels. That is, it was growth rates and said, well, we're doing better than we were the previous month or the previous quarter. I would argue that the level of output and employment were still substantially below what we could have, we could have had if we had not had the crisis of the Great Recession. And I would point out that there are some signs of weakness in the U.S. in the early 2015 data. It's still pretty early to tell, but some of the jobs reports have been disappointing. And it was just reported a few days ago, a revision of the first quarter output numbers, GDP numbers, to a negative 0.7, quite disappointing in many respects. There's probably some seasonal factors at work and a tough winter, especially in the Northeast, but nonetheless well below what many economists were projecting. So I want to emphasize here it's the economic weakness of the crisis, of the Great Recession, that led to the reduction, if there has been a reduction in potential output, and I think there probably has. And the economy could have been on a much higher growth path. This is not some kind of natural or unavoidable phenomenon, in my view, and that's fundamental to the argument I want to make with you this evening. So before I get into explaining what actually happened and then leading to where we are right now, let me just share with you this one chart, which I think is quite striking. A motivating fact looking at stagnant household demand, looking at the purchasing of the U.S. household sector. So I've actually plotted here the actual values, see if I can move my cursor around. So what you see is a very stable upward trend in consumer spending This one happens to be estimated from 2000 to 2006, the peak of the previous business cycle to the peak of the more recent business cycle. But you could go back further. You could do this all sorts of ways. You notice that the actual data just lie almost exactly along this trend. This was the way the U.S. economy was generating the sales and the demand that businesses needed to employ the labor force, to see some recovery in labor force participation, to see a decline in the unemployment rate. And I want to argue very forcefully here that in no sense was this amount of demand excessive. Now, people have pushed back on that. I'm sure there will be some questions like this. Well, you know, we were financing it with lots of debt. They were building way too many houses. And I'm happy to respond to those kinds of concerns. But in the aggregate, if you look at the U.S. economy, unemployment was falling. That's good. We got down to about 4.5%. That's a good thing, but it wasn't, I don't think it was too low in any sense. There was no acceleration of inflation. If anything, wage growth was relatively stagnant during this period. Interest rates were low. The Federal Reserve, for much of this, was trying to stimulate the economy. You know, we needed this demand. The trend you see in the first half of this chart is a trend of demand and sales growth that businesses needed to at least approximate full employment of the labor force by the end. And look what happens after really the beginning. This starts already in 2007, that we dropped way off the trend. Now, it looks like the drop itself is not dramatic here, but if you compare that to this history, this really is a historic drop. You know, consumption spending tends to march upward over time, at least it has, in a very steady way. So to see this kind of stagnation for several years is actually quite unusual. And yes, the U.S. economy has resumed growing, and consumption has resumed growing. But notice that we're not closing this gap. In fact, if you look carefully, the gap is actually growing. The slope of the actual line is less than the slope of the trend we were on prior to the recession. Now, it would be right to say that there's nothing more than a trend here. There's not any deep structural explanation for why this should be the right level. But as a practical matter, over a period of time, not terribly long period of time, this was the way the U.S. economy was maintaining what became an approximation to full employment, and we're not there anymore. Indeed, this gap is $1.6 trillion as of the end of my estimation, which is about 10% of GDP, way above that 3% gap that we estimated before. This is a big number, and motivates where I want to go from here. So what I want to argue is, and if you know the jargon of macroeconomics, this is a Keynesian macroeconomic theory where spending and demand drive the economy, that the U.S. economy received a massive demand shock in the jargon of macroeconomics around the time of the financial crisis and the Great Recession. The U.S. needed that demand of the 2000 to 2006 period to maintain reasonably good economic performance. It wasn't excessive, but we had this historic drop of household spending. This was the reason we had the Great Recession, and that demand gap is the reason for the stagnation in the economy in recent years that I've been talking about. It was entirely unanticipated before 2007, 2008, as those forecasts I showed you indicate. So the question is, what happened to cause this collapse, which will be the next part of my talk. And here I want to link income inequality and household debt and argue that those two factors really sowed the seeds of what became the Great Recession. So let me begin with income inequality. This is just a repeat of the chart you saw from one of the producers of this remarkable data, Piketty, the other night. I'm just showing a part of his numbers. In this case, it's the share of the top 5% of the income distribution in the United States, starting in 1960 and going through 2012, which is the last piece of data I could get. And what you notice is there's really two regimes here. Sorry, backward. The first part, from 1960 to roughly 1980, when income distribution was remarkably stable. That the share of the top 5% just fluctuating between roughly 22 and 24%. It hardly changed at all. And then, starting around 1980, a fairly persistent upward trend. I'm using the data that include realized capital gains, which tend to be quite volatile for the top 5%. And so you see some significant drops around recessions, but the strong upward trend is clear. Even in the last few years, you see the recovery from the Great Recession, that it appears that income distribution is again headed upward. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The total increase here on average is about 15 percentage points, and I want to pause here for a moment to emphasize that is a very big number. These shares have to add up to 1. if you're shifting 15 percentage points of what is effectively the income of a large economy like the U.S. To 1 out of 20 people from 19 out of 20 people, that is a massive shift in income distribution. So here's the case for rising income inequality. Now I want to talk about a little bit more detail of where this comes from. So one thing is, and this won't be a surprise, but this says is income growth dropped for most Americans. So here's a few numbers where we're taking the growth in inflation-adjusted household income for the bottom 95% of households and the top 5% of households. In that period of relative stability in the income distribution, the bottom 95% grew at an average 1.9% per year, and the top 5% 2.1%. Not much different, and that's consistent with the stable share of the top 5. What happens after 1980 is the bottom, the growth rate drops quite significantly to 1.1%, while the top accelerates, and then, of course, we get this shift of the shares that I showed you in the previous chart. Another important factor during this period was the rise in real interest rates that took place in 1980. There was a big increase in interest rates, and the actual nominal interest rates that the Federal Reserve set in an effort to fight inflation, and in fact that was to some extent successful. Inflation fell dramatically, so interest rates adjusted for inflation skyrocketed in the early 1980s. Now here's the key point. What is the requirement to keep the balance sheet of the household sector stable if income growth drops and interest rates go up? Well, what has to happen is the household sector that is experiencing those changes has to cut back on how much it spends relative to its income. So for the bottom 95% anyway, if they were going to avoid an explosion of debt relative to their income, they had to cut back their spending. Otherwise, debt would rise in an unbounded way. And the recent paper that Barry and I have published derives these relationships from the basic accounting in a rigorous way. Okay, so the question is, did they do it? The answer is no. They did not cut their share of income they spent. This is the aggregate number of consumption relative to after-tax income. And you see it actually did fall, but prior to the period we're talking about, it fell in the 1950s and the 1960s, was volatile but relatively stable in the 1970s, and again around 1980. And there is this period around 1980 when lots of things change in these charts that I'm showing you. You get a pretty sustained rise in consumption relative to income until you get to the Great Recession when it drops, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Let me go one step further, because the last 2 years of my life have actually been spent trying to come up with effectively this chart and the extension I'll show you in a few minutes, because it's very, very difficult to decompose consumption spending between different income groups. We can do a pretty good job of looking at how income differs across different households, but consumption data really are not very good. But Barry Cinnamon and I have worked hard to put this together, and we're fairly confident we've got it right. So what this shows is actually the consumption to income share of the bottom 95% itself. That's the red line right here. And here the increase is less dramatic. It's a modest increase of 2 or 3 percentage points. The main point, though, is that it did not decline. That is, that they did not decline, they did not reduce their consumption share as their income growth fell. The top 5 is interesting, but I'll talk more about that in another chart when I have a little more data in a second. So let's focus on the bottom 95 first. So what we're showing here is that their income growth fell, the interest rates they had to pay were rising, and they did not cut back the consumption-income ratio. What is going to be the implication? The implication is that debt will rise. How did they pay for this? They paid for it by borrowing. So here's a long history of U.S. debt to income in the aggregate, going back to around 1950. In the post-war period, there was a buildup in debt, but it ultimately stabilized at a somewhat higher level. This is largely, in my view, the baby boom families buying houses, taking out mortgages, but their income growth was high, and everything stabilized pretty nicely by the mid-1960s and stayed stable until, again, about 1980, when income inequality starts to rise and interest rates rise, the income growth in the lower part drops, and we start to get a quite significant rise in debt, and then it even accelerates more in the late 1990s when the housing boom really is in full force. It peaks about 2005, 2006, and then does come down. We have so-called deleveraging in the Great Recession. just one other little point here. There's two different lines. If you know these data, the blue line is the official numbers. Barry and I have worked a lot to improve the measurement of household disposable income, and there are lots of things in the way the government measures disposable income that might seem a little strange to the average household. For example, I own my own home, which means according to the government, I pay rent to myself. And that rent to myself becomes part of my income. Well, there are reasons for that. I don't want to get into the details, but obviously that income is not available to me to service debt. And so you see the more dramatic rise in our adjusted figures that takes these factors into account. Okay, here is the same kind of data, but now decomposed for the bottom 95% and the top 5%. So the red line is the bottom 95%, and you see the increase is concentrated among people outside of the top of the income distribution. There's some movement, maybe a tiny bit of an upward trend for the top 5%, but the main action here is rising debt outside of the top, which is not surprising, but supports the view that this is the group that was falling behind in the income inequality problem, and this is the group that was borrowing, in a sense, what turned out to be too much. So what was the result of this? What I've done for you is lay out what I think were the seeds of the Great Recession. Actually, let me go back to this chart. This high debt level was, in fact, unsustainable. You couldn't keep growing debt to income year after year after year after year. The question of what turns it around is interesting and beyond what I have the time to talk about this evening, but this is the seeds of the financial crisis. When this no longer could continue, when this group of people were cut off from credit, they stopped buying houses, the house prices stopped to rise, the collateral for the loans fell, we got what became the Great Recession. We got a collapse in household spending, and this was the Great Recession, the direct cause of the Great Recession. Who cut back when this happened? So here's an extension of the chart I showed you earlier. And what you see here is a big contrast between the bottom 95% and the top 5%. The bottom 95% actually did cut back. Now, finally they did. They moved back down towards what turned out to be at least somewhat more sustainable spending pattern during this period. Did the top 5% do the same? No, they did exactly the opposite. They increased consumption relative to income. So let me just share a little bit of economic theory with you. Economists like to talk about a model they call, there's a lot of different terms for it, the life cycle model of consumption, the permanent income theory of consumption. Sometimes it's called consumption smoothing. The basic argument is that people would like to keep their spending path, their consumption, the things they buy, smooth relative to their income. So if their income drops, they hope that they can keep their consumption, still pretty high, not have their consumption drop as much. What that means is, in periods of recession, when incomes go down, that the ratio of consumption to income should rise. And that's exactly what happens if you're relatively affluent in the United States. That here's a recession period, here's a recession period, here's the Great Recession period. When incomes fell, the ratio, consumption stayed pretty stable, and consumption relative to income went up. Not so if you're everybody else, if you're in the bottom 95%. In fact, when some basic economic theory would have predicted that consumption to income would be rising, in fact, it fell. Why? Because they were cut off from the credit spigot that was feeding their consumption going forward. Just more evidence that this inequality, these differences between these groups were quite significant in the macroeconomics that led to the Great Recession. This is just to show, this is an aggregate chart. The big black arrow there shows that when you adjust for our cash flow measures of consumption, you get a massively bigger decline. And so there's maybe even more there than in this picture, which is based on the more official statistics. But that's a technicality. It doesn't change the main message from tonight. So I want to finish up now in the last few minutes with a discussion of where we are and how inequality is playing a role in the stagnant economy of the United States in these last years. The title here is a nuanced role for inequality because it's a little bit complex. It's not straightforward. There is a fairly straightforward story for why rising inequality would slow an economy. And it is that, as our data show, that high-income people spend a smaller share of their income than everybody else. So if you redistribute income upwards, total spending in the economy will fall. A dollar taken away from the bottom 95% given to the 5% reduces total spending. And if you believe that spending is an engine of the economy, and I do think there's a lot of evidence that that is correct, then this could create a drag on the economy. The problem with this simple story, however, is that is one of timing. In fact, so many of you here will hear Paul Krugman tomorrow, and Paul Krugman says that when looking at some of these arguments, that he is sympathetic to the idea that inequality is holding back the economy in principle, but he just doesn't think the data work. I somewhat disagree. I actually fundamentally disagree. My research for the last 3 years has been trying to show the opposite case. And the timing problem, you have to think about what happened in the actual history that the U.S. experienced. That this borrowing behavior, the borrowing to spending of the bottom 95% postponed the demand drag caused by rising inequality. It was true that their income was growing more slowly, but they did not cut back on their consumption because they had the motivation to and the ability to borrow. And here I want to emphasize that this required the financial system. When I tell this story, as I have around the world a number of times in recent years, I often get a question, well, I thought the Great Recession was all about, collateralized debt obligations and shadow banking and deregulation of the financial system, the falling of the ending of the Depression era Glass-Steagall regulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in some broad sense, I agree with that. That is, that it was the access to finance that was absolutely fundamental to this. The bottom 95% needed to be able to borrow, and the financial system provided that credit. Indeed, many people would argue, and I would agree with this, the financial system encouraged it. That because it was profitable, this financial innovation encouraged people to take on more debt. So therefore, allowing them to spend more, and therefore postponing the demand drag from rising inequality. But this ended with the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, the middle class was forced to cut its demand. It could no longer borrow and in some sense spend beyond its means. The problem is we needed that demand. Going back to the chart I showed 7 or 8 slides ago, we needed that demand to stay at full employment. We lost it. We didn't replace it. So you can get the basic story here, and let me just summarize the evidence for it. One is that debt rises when inequality began to increase. The timing is right on in this respect. To the extent that, I think it's almost certainly true, that financial fragility was central to the dynamics that caused the Great Recession. This financial fragility was concentrated in the bottom 95%. It was that group that saw the slower income growth. The bottom 95% was the group that cut back in the recession. The top 5% were actually increasing their consumption relative to their income, behaving really differently. And one additional piece of evidence, which is already implied by the trend I showed you before, the consumption recovery has been remarkably weak. And my point being that high inequality is now constraining demand growth, as this chart will try to show. So this is another one of my index charts, where instead of indexing employment, I've indexed consumption. And this is our adjusted household demand measure of consumption, the actual cash spending that households are undertaking adjusted for inflation. So for the last 5 recessions, I've indexed them all to begin at 100. And what you see is, if I could pull my cursor up again, that there's some differences in the previous recessions. A bit of decline in consumption in some of them. Actually, in the early 2000s, no decline at all. But recovery was relatively quick and quite strong, so that once you got 7 years out from the beginning of the recession, that in every other business cycle in the U.S. going back to the 1970s, that consumption was in the neighborhood of 115% to 120% higher than it was at the beginning of the recession. What's the experience now? It's 2% higher. 2% cumulatively over the entire 7-year period. So it's clear that the consumption recovery is remarkably stagnant, and I want to argue that that's the source of the difficulties in employment and in output and in incomes in the aggregate that I've emphasized for the U.S. economy at the beginning of the talk. So wrapping up here a bit, what are the consequences? One thing is just to make a very simple argument. If you are willing to accept that demand is now too low, and that's why we're having this stagnant economy, and you're willing to accept that the share of income spent declines as we move up the income distribution, so the rich generally spend a smaller share of their income than everyone else, then it is true, because of these 2 simple facts, that high inequality is contributing to the stagnation. I've given you a rather extensive, sophisticated sense of data, but the basic argument is really quite straightforward, and the result is that we have a disappointing recovery. Another consequence is that deleveraging is not by itself enough to restore demand growth. There was a lot of discussion once it became clear how deep the Great Recession was and how serious the problems were in the financial sector, that we would need to have, or there would be a relatively slow recovery because of the need to pay down this debt. People may know of the work by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff that talks about long histories of these things. When we have financial crises, recoveries are slower. And I agree with that, but it's not enough, because it's not just the borrowing, it's the fact that the borrowing was postponing the demand drag from rising inequality. And to the extent that we still have, as Thomas Piketty pointed out to us, rising inequality, then we still face a macroeconomic problem with stagnation. It's also inconsistent in this world to be calling for government austerity. That we have this demand gap from the private sector. To suggest that the government should also be cutting back is just magnifying the problem. That's true in the U.S., it's true in Europe. We may talk a bit more about that. And then also that recovery relies to a large part on the spending of the affluent, of the rich. So this is my last chart. This is taking our data and presenting it in a somewhat different way. So again, an index, starting in this case in 1989 when our disaggregated data begin, and looking at the total consumption spending of the top 5%, at least indexed to 100, and the consumption spending of the bottom 95%. And what you see is in the first years, in the early 1990s, these were basically tracking. Now, of course, on a per household basis, rich people spend more than everybody else. But the growth rates were roughly tracking each other. The affluent begin to pull away from everyone else in the middle 1990s, but still the bottom 95 continues to grow until we get to the Great Recession. When the bottom 95 stagnate, there is a bit of a dip for the top 5, even though they raised consumption relative to their income. Their total consumption did go down, but you can see at the end, just one data point, but a strong recovery. The top 5 are coming back in the U.S., and I think if I could extend to 2013 and 2014, we'd see even more of this. But, you see my little attempt at Italian here on the side. Questo non è la mobilità sociale. This is not social mobility. This is a greater and greater share of the consumption, of the production of the economy being allocated to the top of the income distribution. You see in my title there, economic democracy with a question mark. In the U.S., we like to talk a lot about democracy. It's a very big, civic virtue in many respects. It's talked a lot about on both the left and especially the right. But in the economic sphere, this is not democracy. In addition, I put the question, where is the focus of innovation? To the extent that the affluent are driving a larger and larger share of consumer spending and the demand that we have in the economy, then that's where business is going to focus. That's where they're going to innovate. They'll try to find new and better products that the people who have the money can purchase. There's nothing new about that, but it's problematic as this continues going forward. So what are the broader lessons? And I believe this is my last slide. There are other countries facing secular stagnation. Japan, most obviously, the Eurozone where we are right now, Italy in particular. I looked at the data for Italy. It was real GDP production is 9% below its recent peak in the early 2000s. That's a stunning decline in a developed country. This is the problem of stagnation is obviously not concentrated in the U.S. I think some of the dynamics that I talked about of rising inequality and household debt certainly apply to countries like Spain and Portugal, in the UK to a large extent, maybe less so in Italy, although as Piketty points out, the inequality problem is certainly here in Italy as well. So inequality is high and rising. That, from this perspective, slows demand generation. So these lessons from the U.S. analysis apply more broadly. Everybody wants to know and think about policies to reform this situation and to generate a more equal distribution of income. Tony Atkinson, who is here, and I heard one of his talks, is an articulate and informed person to talk about these things. He discusses both the intrinsic and instrumental reasons we need to reduce inequality. The intrinsic reasons are basically because it's the right thing to do. in particular focusing on the bottom part of the income distribution who live in poor conditions in our rich economies, and that is unacceptable for intrinsic reasons. But there's also the instrumental reasons, the idea that actually reducing inequality can improve the overall performance of the economy. And that is the message of the work that I've shared with you tonight. That is, it's not, I believe social justice is very, very important in this context, but also the overall performance of the economy is being compromised by the inability to generate demand coming from rising inequality. So let me stop here. I think we're pretty much on the time that we planned. I'd be happy to take a few questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Allora, adesso c'è spazio per qualche domanda, poi
Now we can entertain a couple of questions. I also have a question.
And I think we probably all accept the basic conclusion that you're drawing, that if we can reduce the inequality, particularly at the top, that's, first of all, the right thing to do, and secondly, would be beneficial. But let me just inject a little more pessimism into the discussion if we're looking at what we should expect the performance of the U.S. economy to be over the next few years. It seems to me that one thing we're observing is that we've had a big deleveraging, and that deleveraging of debt is the right thing to do, and it's permanent. In other words, the great moderation we can now see was built on shifting sands. It was built on debt accumulation that was unsustainable. So if we assume that going forward, we're not going to go back to massive debt creation. We're going to be held back in our growth potential by having a more rational allocation of debt. How much can we really expect to gain in terms of getting back to the old potential growth pattern out of dealing with the inequality problem? It doesn't seem to me that it's likely to be that big.
if you want.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Jim. My new friend here in Bergamo, Trento. Bergamo was the earlier part of the trip. So thank you for the interesting comment, most of which I agree with. So it is, I agree we're in a deleveraging period. I agree that we need to be in a deleveraging period. The household balance sheet was unsustainable. The dynamics of it, the way that the debt was growing was unsustainable. This had to change. This is a lesson we would have gotten. I should have mentioned one of my mentors and an important economist in the U.S. and also in Italy, Hyman Minsky, who talked about this kind of dynamic more on the business side, but applied to the household sector. It had to go this way in many respects. So this is, in fact, the reality. It's the reality I expect for the next few years. Where I somewhat disagree, though, is that could it have been different, in particular if we'd had faster income growth across the income distribution over the past 20 years? I think the answer is it could have been different. And I would point to the history of the U.S. in the post-war period, where we had very, very strong consumption growth, but income growth across the distribution, if anything, a bit of a reduction in inequality during that period of time. Also, just to share a statistic with my economist friend here, so it's a more technical part of our research that I talked about with graduate students today, but we've actually looked to see this kind of magnitude. If we look at that share of the amount of shift that took place in the income distribution, roughly 14 or 15 percentage points, and make sensible estimates about what the different consumption behaviors would be in these different groups, we actually can explain a gap in demand as the result of that shift of at least 9.5%, and depending on people's views about consumption, could even be larger, probably moving up towards 15%. So it actually can be quite substantial. Now, this is a long-term phenomenon. We're not going to jump back there. But in terms of the underlying potential of the U.S. economy to produce, I think we could be doing a lot better. And it's the nature of this set of dynamics that's pulled us away. What does that suggest from a policy point of view? It says we need to be thinking about dealing with income distribution, and I think there are many, many reasons to do that, and I would not even argue that the material or the work I've shared with you tonight is the most important reason, but I think it is an important reason. And what our research is trying to do is to develop this part of the story, that is how rising income inequality can be quite significant, for a major economy like the U.S.
Io volevo aggiungere una...
I also have a question. Can you expand on the comparison between US and Europe? My impression is that in Europe, the level of indebtedness of households is much lower than that of the US households. Does that have implications? So we have less inequalities, or do we have inequalities even though the financial burden on households is lower?
First off, let me qualify my answer that I'm focused on the U.S. I study the U.S. I don't have detailed knowledge of any other country in the world, but travel here in Europe and talk to a lot of Europeans and have paid some attention to some of the developments here. So I think the answer to the question, the comparisons between the U.S. and Europe and the similarities and differences, depends a lot on which country you look at it. Here, I don't think Europe can be taken as a whole. So as I mentioned I don't think it's on the slide here that's at the end, but I did mention in my comments that Spain in particular had a very similar dynamic with housing, with borrowing. I don't know that much about income distribution in Spain.
For instance, in Italy, we are not so, the family are not so...
right.
So
Spain had this, Portugal had this, UK had this, and in UK I know a little more. I think there you do have the rising inequality issue too, so I think there's maybe more of a parallel. The Italian case clearly is somewhat different. I wish I knew more about it. I should be studying it more because of my affection for this country. And I agree. My sense is that, for example, mortgage debt is not as big of an issue there. There are actually a number of studies going back to some of my earlier research 20, 30 years ago, which was looking at comparisons between the U.S. and Italy in terms of the way that more houses were financed. So there is a different story there. I do think, though, that this notion of demand stagnation has to be taken seriously. And, again, just to emphasize, if that's the way you're going, then the fiscal austerity, which is coming from to a large extent, the nature of the political and economic relationships in the European Union becomes, a major problem, for Italy in that respect. So I actually think the framework could be used. Obviously, I'm not in a position to actually do it, but I think this kind of framework and way of thinking could be used. And I would pay attention to the household sector here, maybe not so much because of debt, but looking at inequality and looking at housing and looking at the way these kinds of dynamics are playing out in the Italian context.
Salve, io volevo chiedere un suo...
What do you think about the reasons or how is it possible to implement social equality? I am a student. We had a very active discussion concerning justice, Robert Nozick, Amartya Sen theories, the issue of social justice. There are different schools of thought. I think it was Hayek who stated that the idea of social justice by itself has no value. I mean, I think that we have to defend social justice, but how can we do that pretty aggressively from a philosophical viewpoint and also from an economic viewpoint? Is there a way to do that?
Thank you for the question, which I got in a very competent translation, I hope. At least I understand it, so hopefully I'm answering the question that you think you're asking. How is it possible to implement social equality? You know, a reference to, this is for the English speakers in the audience, I should probably do this if you're not listening to the translation. How does this link to theories of social justice of Amartya Sen, John Rawls maybe not be mentioned, but it was there. You mentioned Hayek and Nozick on the other side of this, and my views on these kinds of things and how economists might respond to them. So this is a big question. A whole course, in some sense, at least, could be used here. It's an area in my own reading and thinking that it is relatively recent. And so one part of the answer to the question is to talk a little bit about economics training and how it plays out in this context. Most economists don't read these things, and this is something that economists have been ignoring largely as a group. Don't teach it, don't read it, don't talk about it, don't deal with the issues of social justice, and I think that's a huge problem. I've thought that was a huge problem for my entire career, and part of what has attracted me to do the kind of work you see tonight was the mixing of my interest in Keynesian macroeconomics with ultimately a concern with income distribution and social justice. I'm not putting forward social justice directly in my analysis, but it's there in my own views. So I'd like to criticize my own profession of economics as not paying enough attention to these kinds of issues. You asked the question of how this can be done in many respects, and I think to a large extent your question seemed to focus more on the philosophical aspects of changing the way that economics is discussed, is taught, is in many respects, and that I support. But I think there's, we do need to move in this direction, and here I would point to Atkinson in terms of policies designed to work in this way. That we do need to pay attention to the need to achieve a more equal distribution of income and more uniform growth across the distribution of income. And there's a variety of ways to think about this. You could think about this in terms of labor market institutions, of institutions that are trying to protect wages and increase wages. In the U.S., the minimum wage is remarkably low, and it's been falling after adjustment for inflation for many, many years. The ability of people to have jobs, one of the best ways to increase wage growth is to have strong labor markets. And the problem from the point of view that I presented tonight is that the weak labor markets, stagnation, high unemployment, because of rising inequality, leads to lower wage growth. And so it's a vicious circle. That even makes a stronger argument for things like fiscal stimulus, to get the economy going, to improve the labor market situation so wage growth rises. I've recently become very interested in programs to provide jobs at a living wage through some kind of public activity or a public-private partnership where the job pays a good wage, has good, what we call in the U.S., benefits, medical care, child care, some provision for retirement, decent working conditions, to set a floor on what's an adequate job in a rich country. I just read, just an hour or two before coming in here, an op-ed in the New York Times by an interesting commentator by the name of Mark Bittman, who writes a lot about food, but in particular what he was talking about food workers and some movements in the U.S. to raise the wages of food workers, but he made a more general point which I very much agree with. That is, if the only way that a job can be viable in the economy is to pay the worker a wage that is dramatically below what's a reasonable living wage given the context of the wealth of the society, then that job shouldn't exist. And I strongly support that view, and we need to move in that direction. I don't think the evidence points to the fact that raising things like the minimum wage has a big negative impact on jobs. But in the end, if a few jobs go away that are providing too low of a wage, maybe that's the way it should be. Maybe we shouldn't be having that kind of production, or at least paying those kinds of prices. He was talking specifically about food workers picking lettuce and say, if our salad's more expensive, maybe that's the way it has to be to treat the workers who pick the vegetables in a reasonable way. So, this is a big issue, and it's outside the scope of my research, but I applaud your commitment to social justice and think that there are just a wide range of compelling reasons to move in this direction.
May I?
Pur non essendo un economista, sono stato in...
I'm not economist, and I greatly appreciated your talk, and I followed it very closely. I was wondering whether the same conclusions couldn't be supported also by the study on the growing of savings, or on focusing on wealth, if that is possible.
So the question is, how could this perspective that I've shared with you this evening be maybe recast in terms of saving and wealth? And this is a tricky business. I think it's an excellent question, because you hear me, at least implicitly, saying the American economy doesn't have enough consumption, not enough consumption to get the full employment, and that's a statement I'm going to stand by. But at the same time, we know at the individual level, if you want to provide a certain kind of security for yourself now and into the future and pass something on to your children, you need to save, not consume. So how do you square these kinds of things? I mean, this is a deep question in economic theory. And the answer, which I've come to a few years ago in lots of discussions with a variety of interesting people, is that there is a kind of paradox between the microeconomics, the individual behavior of the household, and the aggregate, that for any individual, of course, your wealth will be higher if you save more. For the economy as a whole, there is what we Keynesians call the paradox of thrift, that more saving in total does not improve the economy. In fact, it can make the economy weaker, and if that leads to lower capital accumulation, fewer homes constructed, then in the end, you have lower wealth. So how do you reconcile that? That basically what's happening with each household is that the individual saver is competing to own a share of the wealth created by investment in the economy as a whole. And this is that, is that conundrum. So how do we deal with that in some respects? I think that's a really deep question. And in many respects, I think it is important to have more wealth at the lower part of the income distribution, the middle part of the income distribution, and beyond, but we can't really get that by reducing consumption. So one thing, of course, is increasing income growth there, so there's room. We have to have more investment in the broad sense, but I also think there's a role for government to play here. I would be supportive of something that the phrase I would use for it, but I'm certain it's not original with me, is a citizenship account, which is actually a government-provided fund of every person at birth to start building wealth and maybe even investing in the economy as a whole. I have the view that probably, we've seen profit shares rise, but we need to spread the wealth of that profit share around a bigger group, which means we need to find ways to have greater share of ownership spread out. So this is rather a vague answer. It's something I haven't worked out all that much, but the basic story is I do believe it's important not only to talk about equalization in income, which is what I emphasize tonight, but also equalization in wealth for these kinds of reasons.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a question about shadow banking that you mentioned earlier. Considering its effect on or influence on the increasing of the inequality in the US, in your opinion, what will the effect of the Dodd-Frank Act will be? Thank you.
So I just want to make sure I got the first thing. Just repeat the first sentence you said. You have a question about?
Well, the effect of Dodd-Frank Act that it will have on the limits or the regulation of the shadow banking.
The central bank, okay.
Yeah. Shadow banking.
Shadow banking.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it's a good question. Again, my part of this is looking more at the consumer side, less of the financing side. But I have paid a lot of attention to these issues in my teaching, and I think the Dodd-Frank is a relatively weak control in many respects. I do think there is an appropriate role. for this kind of regulation. A lot of the things that American households were doing in credit markets, especially in the last 5 to 10 years of the financial crisis, they shouldn't have been doing. The kinds of loans that they were taking were inappropriate. It makes no sense, in my view, for somebody to take out a mortgage that they cannot service at market interest rates with their income. And so there needs to be more effective protection along those lines. I don't think we've really gotten that much from Dodd-Frank in that sense. More is the focus on the part of the system which I'm less familiar with. Like you say, shadow banking and the financial regulations themselves. There is this kind of attempt to stop to prevent systemically important institutions from being bailed out by the government. My rough sense is that will not work the next time we have a financial crisis, that these things tend to be very backward-looking. This is a perspective I learned from Hyman Minsky, that financial institutions find ways to innovate around these kinds of regulations. So these regulations are always fighting the last battle, the last crisis. So I'm not terribly optimistic that this will work. Now, I will say this, that I think the financial system is somewhat chastened by what happened here. And this goes back to the first question about the potential for the U.S. economy to grow going forward, that we are not going to restart this kind of borrowing behavior. And I actually think that's right, at least for some time. Although following my mentor Minsky, will tell you that, well, will it be 5 years? Will it be 10? Will it be 20? But even though we've had a big drop, and there's a much more conservative financing structure out there these days, not so much due to regulation, but due to actual behaviors, in my view, that will, I suppose, eventually change, but probably not as quickly as it has in the past. This has been a big change.
Grazie mille al professor Fazzari.
Thank you very much, Professor Fazzari, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Fare bene il proprio mestiere.
Non diventare semplicemente dei funzionari di un'Europa. Disuguaglianza.
Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando è una parte.
Come si fa? La scienza ha senso, i contratti in sé non sono né buoni né